Mark McHenry just retired, and what is he doing on his first day off? He's right here at the Kansas City Public Library. I think he deserves a round of applause. Did great things for our parks. We also have as sponsors tonight the Penn Valley Park Conservancy and the Roanoke Park Conservancy. Thank you. As a former Roanoke resident, I know how passionate Roanokers are. This is a part of an ongoing series that we have about what makes a great city. How can we go about continuing to have a great city? What more can we do to make this a great city? And we have, some of you will know, our Strong Town series that we've been doing about small-scale development, of which many of us around here are fans. We also have, coming up this month, promoted and partnered with the Kansas City Design Center and, remarkably, the City Manager's Office. Building, thank you, and we're grateful to the City Manager for that and many other things. We have Matthias, and I may or may not be pronouncing his name correctly, Boo, who is a Dutch architect talking about building resilient cities. And he's the founder of One Architecture and Urbanism, an award-winning design firm that has offices in both Amsterdam and New York. So those of you who are interested in urban planning, which all of you are, obviously, you might be interested in that. I also will mention, while we're on the subject of politics, that on March 20th, the Building Resilient Cities will be March 21st here at the Plaza. And also at the Plaza on March 20th, Wednesday, March 20th, we have partnering with the Black Community Fund, Greater Kansas City Community Foundation, KCPT. We will have Who Will Lead KC. We'll have all the mayoral candidates here, and the program will be moderated by Nick Haynes. So it is my job. Sorry, yeah, a little housekeeping detail. Someone tonight has lost a ring, and if you have lost a ring, it is upstairs at the circulation desk, and you will have to describe it, of course, to the librarian to get your ring back. And so, don't everyone rush out right now, okay? Okay, did I get that right? It was in the women's bathroom. Sorry, it was in the women's bathroom, so guys, forget it. Okay, so there's this moment in Kansas City history when they've done the Parks and Rec plan. August Meyer and George Kessler have done the plan, and they call Frederick Law Olmsted down from Chicago, where he's working on the World's Fair, the Great Columbian Exhibition, and they ask him to look at it, and he looks at it and he says, well, you know, it's pretty good. He says, but there is no big park. There's no big park like Central Park. And that tells us something, I think, about Kessler, about Meyer, ultimately about Nichols, J.C. Nichols, and William Rockhill Nelson. Though we have big parks, we certainly have Swope Park, which is actually a bigger park than Central Park in terms of total square miles. What they designed, what was so special about what they did, was the scale. It was essentially, you can still see it on the Plaza, you can still see it in the neighborhoods, Southmoreland or Rock Hill, around the Nelson. It was essentially a village scale. And we've always worked from village scale, and it's part of the charm of Kansas City. It also is one of the problems with Kansas City because we don't have many great public spaces. And Kessler was essentially a designer of village-type spaces. Nichols himself, and both Nichols and Kessler spent time in Europe, and they loved the village square, and yet there aren't many village squares in Kansas City, but there are village streets in Kansas City. So I think it is interesting to note the importance of scale and proportion, and their focus on the beauty of scale and proportion when we think about the city today, and we think about our parks and the necessity of our parks and the necessity of proportion and scale in our parks. Kessler got that right, Nichols got it right, Nelson got it right. And we need to think about development today and whether or not we're getting it right in terms of scale and in terms of the mixture of what we do, the commercial, the residential, and again, as I say, the scale. That's my editorial comment for the night. But I get a chance tonight, thank you. I get a chance tonight to introduce Terry Ryder, the new director of the Kansas City's Parks and Recreation. She's a special person because she started out in the parks at the age of 10. There is a story about her beginning at that age to be concerned about parks, about the problems in parks, about cleaning up the parks. And she became an equipment operator in the park system many years ago, and has ascended from that to become the director of Parks and Rec. And so we're excited to have her here on our stage for the first time, and we expect to be partnering with Parks and Rec many times in the future. So please help me welcome Terry Ryder, the director of Kansas City Parks and Rec.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to the library for putting this series together. Making cities great. We may be a little biased in Parks and Recreation, but we think parks are one of the most critical elements of that. So welcome to our city within a park, and we look forward to this evening. So everything's about partnerships, and that term gets probably overused, but we could not manage 12,000 acres in this city on the resources we have, so we're dependent on partners, and two of those great partners are our conservancies, the Conservancy over at Roanoke and the Conservancy at Penn Valley. And they're models. They're models for how we get the community engaged, how we create this sense of place that brings people together, even to cut bush honeysuckle hours upon hours upon hours. So really appreciate the opportunity. I want to welcome you. I know Mark's here. I saw him. He 44 years. I mean, he spent part of his life, 2/3 of his life, dedicated to this department, and all the things we see and all the things we have are because of people like him and the team he built to put that together. So welcome, enjoy. I've had a chance to talk with the speaker a little bit. I think this is going to be a great night. And I'll introduce Kurt Watkins. He's the president of the Roanoke Park Conservancy, and he'll be here to introduce our speaker and try and get things going. So thank you very much for coming out, and look forward to working with you all.
Good evening. Thank you, Terry. I'm with the Roanoke Park Conservancy. I also want to thank sponsors for this evening. In addition to the conservancies previously mentioned, we thank the Urias Family Foundation, J.E. Dunn, the Kessler Society, Kissick Construction, Midtown, KC Now, Furnesis, Landscape Architects, Main Corps, and the Prairie Gateway chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Thanks to all these organizations for helping us bring this program together, and thank you all for coming out to hear what we have to say about this three-part series that represents a continuation of the great Kansas City is a Great City series begun last year. Clearly, notable cities have great parks and are recognized for such. Tonight's program is part one of a three-part series about our Kansas City parks. They really are unique. They're really special. There's Kessler genius expressed in our park system that deserves to be understood, perpetuated, and revered. This series, I must tell you, has an agenda. It is to appreciate, understand, assess, and commit to sustaining the historic greatness of our parks in pursuit of great city status for Kansas City. It might be subtitled rhetorically, if not us, the residents of Kansas City, who will intend that Kansas City park system be a great system of parks in pursuit of this great Kansas City status. This very notion of who, if not us who, was articulated last month. Maybe some of you were here in this auditorium when Bruce Katz spoke in his new book entitled The New Localism. Mr. Katz said, I paraphrase, that communities who continue to wait for federal and state solutions are bound to continue to be disappointed because federal and state governments are no longer reliable partners for city communities. Cities mentioned in the book as exemplary models of grasping and implementing this premise of new leadership acting in partnership with local governments are Indianapolis, our longtime nemesis, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, and interestingly, Copenhagen. So this three-part series is co-produced by two local park conservancies. Each has on its own forged public-private enterprises with Kansas City to enhance local public assets. Indeed, these conservancies and their activities are microcosms of the Katz premise. The Roanoke Park Conservancy and the Penn Valley Park Conservancy are public-private partnerships forged by individuals banding together with a common interest and a common conviction that these parks, our parks, their parks, should be great in ways meaningful to their particular locales. So tonight, we talk about part one of the series, and it's the great beginnings for the Kansas City Park System. It is thanks to the urgings, as Cosby mentioned, of August Meyer in the late 1800s, and the genius of George Kessler, that Kansas City has a uniquely designed parks and boulevard system. So important that we have the great bones to perpetuate this notion of attaining great city status. The program tonight is a reminder to us on how important the system is and how wonderful the original concepts were. On April 30th, we will have part two of this series, and that is what happened in the ensuing 100 years after the parks were developed. It is an assessment of the current situation of the parks and how it progressed or failed to do so through these 100 years and through distractions of global distractions, of war, of some strange public policies. But anyway, it's an assessment of the current situation by Leon Younger, who is a consultant from Indianapolis, who has experience and acquaintanceship with the park system. And most significantly, on May 28th, the call to action, if you will. Part three is how do we make the choices to achieve great Kansas City parks to sustain the idea of a great city. And we will learn what other cities are doing to support their park systems through private and public partnerships. Interestingly, this speaker for the third part comes to us from the aforementioned exemplary city in the Katz book of Pittsburgh, where she is the curator at yet another conservancy, the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy. So we're looking forward to all three of these, and especially looking forward to tonight about the history and the great beginnings of the Kansas City Park System. Tonight's speaker has most generously traveled from Colorado as an advocate of our undertaking. He is an astute George Kessler historian, and like Kessler, Kurt Culbertson is a landscape architect. He comes with quite the portfolio, I tell you. Professionally, Dr. Culbertson is the chairman and CEO of the Design Workshop, which is an international firm in the pursuit of ideas to create special places. Dr. Culbertson and his contributions are very highly regarded in the industry. He is a full member of the Urban Land Institute, a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, also a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, the Urban Design Forum, and the Dumbarton Oaks Association. He is a past chair of the Rocky Mountain Young Presidents Organization, and in 2016, most notably, he was recognized by the American Land Institute Society and received the highest honor that they bestow on one of their members. We are very fortunate and very pleased and very grateful for the presence this evening of Dr. Kurt Culbertson. Please welcome Dr. Culbertson.
Good evening, or as we like to say in Louisiana, how y'all are. I'd like to wish you a happy Mardi Gras, and it is always a pleasure to be in Kansas City where everything is up to date. And what I'd like to do, it's amazing how many people missed that line, by the way. What I'd like to do is cover a lot of territory here, and I'd like to do a couple of things. I'd like to share with you the life and career of George Kessler. I think it's important for you to understand how the Kansas City system fits within his portfolio, and in that effort to explain the ideas that drive the creation of this system, and to understand the qualities of the man that were necessary to create the system and the principles that guide the plan itself. And then I'm going to be a little bold at the end, unscripted, not entirely unscripted, and reflect a bit on what these principles might mean for Kansas City itself. Probably a task for later speakers in this series, but something I thought was important to reflect upon. Because more than any other individual, George Kessler carried the professional landscape architecture to the heartland of America. He bestowed upon cities like Kansas City a European urbanity of the old world, but in a uniquely American way. The form and character of this city, and probably 40 cities around the country, are immediately the result of his work. George was born on July 16th, 1862. I'm a Leo. I think that makes him a Leo. In Bad Frankenhausen, Germany, little town that you see in the upper, not sure how the pointer works here, in the upper left-hand corner of this map, in what was formerly, until 1991, East Germany, near the university towns of Weimar and Jena and Erfurt. By the way, I speak German with a distinctly southern accent, so if any of you are German speakers, please forgive me, buy me a beer later, and maybe I'll loosen up my tongue a bit. The family immigrated when George was about 2 years old, settled for a while in Hoboken, New Jersey, a predominantly German city. And by some reports, they lived for a while in St. Louis and Hannibal, Missouri, and Racine, Wisconsin, although I've never been able to find a true record of that. But they eventually made their home in Dallas, Texas, where George's father, Ernst Edward, was, by various reports, a mercantilist or a cotton farmer, but apparently quite bad at both of those things. Dallas at the time was only 40 years old. It was a rough and tumble community of about 5,000 inhabitants. George found a job. His mother taught piano. George found a job as a cash boy for Alex Singer's department store, a German immigrant in the city. So when George's father died in 1878, we see the beginnings of what was the first great characteristics of this man. He was a highly educated individual. He was committed to lifelong learning, and hopefully all of you meet that same criteria. That's why you're here tonight. And it was his ability to learn and adapt over the course of his career that led to his great success. And as was mentioned, I believe earlier, George was one of the founding members of the Urban Land Institute, created by Jesse Clyde Nichols, by what became the American Planning Association, and his life and his work continually evolved. in 1878, when his father died, his mother took George, his sister Antoine, and returned to Germany. Now, why she returned to Germany, we don't really know. Perhaps as a new widow, she depended upon extended family for emotional support, perhaps for financial support. But at the age of 16, it was time for George to enter higher education. And I looked it up. I couldn't quite understand why in 1878 he wouldn't have just gone to the University of Missouri or another fine institution like Kansas State or University of Kansas that were all around about that time, and those seemed like a pretty good option to me. But as it turns out, the German universities of the day were the very best in the world. And at George's time, 15% of the students in German universities were American. So he was simply taken by his mother to find the finest education that money could buy. And unlike many of us have done, go to a university and spend 4 years in one college, George seemed to have exercised what the Germans called a Wanderjahr, the idea that he was going to wander around for a year, learn from a bunch of different people, have a variety of different mentors, and learn from all those experiences, except that his wonder year lasted 3 years. The first place that he studied was here, Schloss Belvedere in Weimar, the capital of the Weimar Republic, and a pleasure palace that was built, and its gardens built largely upon traditions of French and Italian gardens, and had been adapted over time to the English school of gardening. And as you can see in this plan, what was remarkable about it was that the Germans, I got to quit hitting that button, the Germans evolved a style that was based on German and French and Italian traditions with the English style. As you can see, a mix of formal gardens around the main castle, English garden in the lower right portion of the plan, but evolved in a particularly German way. And what he also found was the work of prominent German landscape gardeners, Peter Joseph Linné and Friedrich von Sckell, two of the great European landscape gardeners of the time. Armand von Sckell, this happy fellow, was fifth-generation landscape gardener, a Hofgartner, a German term invented in the 18th century, which meant that he was a court or imperial gardener. Now, that's an important thing to realize, because von Sckell, this gentleman, as Kessler in his day, was trained not just to be a designer, but to be an administrator, to understand the management of staff, to understand the finances necessary to realize a great garden, to understand the inner workings of the royal court or city council, whichever you prefer, and to navigate those channels of success in order to create great landscape spaces, right? It's a very different conception of what a landscape architect is, what my profession is for many people today who see themselves as form givers and shapers of landscape, but oftentimes don't dabble in those unattractive issues of management and finance and administration. While George was in Weimar, he had a chance to study at Park an der Elm, a great park created by Johann Wolfgang Goethe. And Goethe's quote, which you may know, you've heard it borrowed by many people, Daniel Burnham being one, "Make no small plans, they lack the spirit to stir the hearts of men." But Goethe said, "Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, magic and power in it. Begin it now." And George, I think, learned that lesson well. A well-educated man, a bold man. Goethe's Park an der Elm was a grand pastoral landscape about a kilometer, actually 2 kilometers of the Elm River that flowed through it, the floodplain of the river, a series of meandering routes protected. And over time, this park has also been joined with Schloss Belvedere, the first one you saw, Schloss Tierfurt, to form in Weimar a greenway. something that you're quite familiar with here. So remember this idea of protecting the river, of creating these green spaces continually along the river, or something that were essential to George's education. He spent about 2 years in Erfurt working for the firm of Haga and Schmidt, understanding the propagation of plant material and how those, the landscape horticultural component of the profession evolved. And then he went with his mother to Potsdam, the imperial town outside of Berlin, where this gentleman, Peter Joseph Linné, had founded in 1824, the first school of landscape gardening, I believe, in Europe. Okay? It's important to remember that the first school of landscape architecture in the United States was not founded until 1900, 76 years after the Germans. So what George was provided with was a professional education that many of his soon-to-be American counterparts did not have. And what he saw were grand elements of architecture, fountains, sound familiar, cascading gardens that form the character of these great gardens. What is remarkable to me about Peter Joseph Linné's work, and it's reflected in this one drawing of the Palace at Sans Souci, is a remarkable ability to mix formal elements of landscape architecture, the grand cascade that you see spilling down. There you go, spilling down here, and these formal axial elements with the informal elements that are to some degree an element of the English gardening style, and then this grand cross-axis. So think about that. If you're familiar with Central Park, or you're familiar with the parks of Frederick Law Olmsted, we think of a pastoral landscape, but these are much more sophisticated designs. These have the ability to respond to the landscape in a formal way, where appropriate, in an informal way as you move into the more rural parts of the landscape, and that becomes the basis for much of Kessler's design. Linné's grand garden at Sans Souci was remarkable because of its prolific use of plant material. I'm reminded when I see this image of the character of Kessler's pergola on the Paseo, and the careful use of architectural elements that form the basis of some of his design as well. I'm really having trouble with this. There we go. While in Berlin, Kessler also had the chance to study Linné's more formal elements in an urban context, the great Unter den Linden Boulevard, which connected the central part of the city. So he had a chance while there to draw on these significant works of German landscape architecture and be formally trained in the German design tradition, and that is what he brought with him to Missouri and to Kansas City. One of the most significant parks that he had a chance to see was Park Muskau, created by Fürst von Muskau, a German prince, in his ancestral homes. And again, as Goethe had done, he preserved the rivers that flowed through his property. He incorporated entire villages into the park. You heard references to villages early on. And he had a chance to carefully control views to distant hills, to distant mountainsides, and to create a continuous circuit of paths and carriageways and so forth that allowed them to visitors to transverse a route through the city or to the park without repeating any one direction at any point in time, a constantly unfolding set of views as you flow through the park. Puckler also strategically accented the park with architectural elements so that there were elements of delight, of folly, and so forth, and the same kinds of principles that you see in Kessler's work here. So let's reflect for a minute on what it means to be a German landscape architect and how German park design differed from those of other countries. One, you see liberal use of architecture, the kind of great staircases we have in Kansas City, the elements of the Paseo and so forth are part of that. The balance of formal and informal elements that you saw in the work of Linné, that's certainly something that we find in Kessler's work. a very liberal use of color. The Germans were great horticulturalists. They gathered plants from all over the world and displayed them. Well, they made liberal use of sculpture and fountains, something that you see here. Olmsted, for example, despised sculptures. There were no sculptures until in Central Park until roughly 20 years after Central Park was completed, and ironically, the first sculpture was of Humboldt, the German. So the Germans always had a way of getting even. The Germans also believed in family-based recreation, active recreation we'll talk about in a minute. It was common for them to have music and theater in their parks. And unlike the parks of the Transcendentalists, the parks you find in New England, which were almost entirely for pastoral contemplation of the landscape, the Germans believed in active recreation, and they believed, God bless them, in beer. Okay? Beer was important to them because it was an essential part of their culture, and I've heard it argued, although my own field research would suggest otherwise, is that German beer of the time did not have quite the alcohol content of the Irish, and so when the Irish were drinking in Central Park and the parks of Brooklyn and so forth, they were sheets to the wind, but the Germans were blissfully going through the night with Gemütlichkeit, a great sense of warmth and camaraderie with their fellow citizens, right? How's that for a marketing slogan, right? So, the thing that's interesting, though, is the Germans also believed in active recreation. Now, remember, many of the parks of this century were built around this idea of passive contemplation, the landscape of pastoralism and so forth. But the Germans had another idea about physical fitness and the idea of exercise. And you're reminded that there are these words in our vocabulary that are German. Kindergarten, gymnasium. The Germans loved to sing. There were Turnvereins in the parks of Kansas City, of Galveston, of Indianapolis, of other great German cities. And so active recreation became a serious part of their process. Now, in George's work over the course of his career, that led to some pretty strange plans from time to time, right? So you have in this plan for Ludlow Park in Hamilton, Ohio, this pastoral sort of English landscape of curving walkways and so forth. You have formal gardens and these geometric floral displays. Got a little bit for everybody in here. And then we still had a wading pool and playground, the active recreation. So I find this a fascinating drawing because it speaks to the conflict that we find in our park systems today, right? If I'm the park director in Kansas City, I have some of you clamoring for quiet places of solitude, of arboretums, of botanical gardens, of leisurely strolls through the park system, and some of you, and I can tell which ones you are arguing for 4 times the amount of soccer and baseball fields that you have today, right? And so we had, even at this time, this continual drama over the appropriate use of parks and so forth and the allocation of space. So you met the charming Armand von Skell. A new character now enters the stage. I like to call him Dead Fred, Frederick Law Olmsted, generally considered the father of American landscape architecture. Olmsted was an interesting guy. You know, having managed a business enterprise, it's important to remember that when Central Park, Olmsted and Vaux created Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted did not have a degree in architecture or design. Frederick Law Olmsted did not have a degree in engineering. Frederick Law Olmsted did not have a degree in horticulture. What Frederick Law Olmsted, in my opinion, was extremely good at was eyeing talent, hiring talent, and managing talent. And when he created Central Park, his 2 principal superintendents were Ignaz Pilat, who was a court gardener from Schönbrunn outside Vienna, and Wilhelm Fischer, another German. So Fred worked the system at the highest levels, but when it came time to execute almost every one of his works, who was that superintendent of the effort, drawing the drawings? A professionally trained German landscape architect. So Kessler was how's that for revisionist history? So Olmsted's own views of nature were greatly shaped by Friedrich Zimmermann's book on solitude. He said that he kept it by his nightstand with the Bible and considered it the second most important book in his life compared to the Bible. Olmsted, I believe, read German. His design precedents were German. The education of his staff and the design talent that he acquired for his projects were also German. So this is important to really understand that there's still a myth that you read about occasionally today that even the Kansas City park system is somehow attributable to Olmsted in some small part, and many of other Kessler's works were attributed to Olmsted and are still attributed to Olmsted. I could show you a website I was looking at the other day, but I would argue that the origins of the Kansas City park system have more of their origins in the parks of Weimar and in the streets of Berlin than in the head of Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, 1881, George, his sister Antoine, his mom Clotilda came back to New York. They settled, curiously, in the Bowery, known at that time as Kleine Deutschland, little Germany. New York at the third largest concentration of Germans in the world at that time, behind Berlin and Vienna, right? And Central Park, there are period pieces that suggest that George wrote to Olmsted to seek employment. Central Park was largely complete by the time George returned to New York. And what he did was find work for a while with Lamotte's florist, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, in the Bowery. And curiously, a florist that still exists in New York today, this time at 30 Rock. So he began his transition to the United States with his mother and father. He did, or mother and sister, he did begin a correspondence with Olmsted, and in this regard, Olmsted did Kessler a great service. In 1882, he recommended to his client, H.H. Honeywell, owner of the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Memphis Railroad, who was building a pleasure park outside of Kansas City, in Merriam, Kansas, called Merriam Park. You see an image of it here. And so these pleasure parks were quite common in the day. Now imagine, you own a railroad. I've got commuters during the week. Weekend rolls around, ridership drops off. What am I going to do? I got an idea. I'll build a park out in the country. I'll charge people to ride out there, charge them to ride back, generate ridership. And so a park became the draw to generate ridership, and Merriam Park was built for this purpose. And you can find all around the country examples of streetcar amusement parks and so forth that were built that many of them have now evolved and become parts of the park system, right? And it's important when you think about Merriam Park to put it in a German context, right? Here was a park that had pavilions for picnics, for parades, for family reunion, had an ice house, kept the beer cold, had a little tier garden, a zoo, and so you had swing sets and other kinds of active recreation that was new to the people of Kansas City, and it was immediately a tremendous success. And it provided that kind of cultural interpretation of a park that Kessler had grown up with and known. The other thing it did is that it introduced George to the railroad industry, okay? So think about the period from 1880 to 1890 was the largest period of railroad growth in the United States history, right? Most of that railroad growth occurred west of the Mississippi, and much of it was based in Kansas City, Missouri, right? So there actually grew up an entire group called the Society of Railroad Gardeners, right? Because if you were arriving by railroad, much like you arrive by plane today, the first thing you saw when you arrived in Lenexa, Kansas, or Albuquerque, New Mexico, was the train station. And remember, at that point in time, there was no Union Station. There was no consolidation of rail lines, and so every rail line had their own set of stations, and everyone arrived there. And so Merriam Park provided the opportunity for George to begin to travel and create projects, railroad grounds, all over the American West, and to grow and build his reputation, a critical part of his success. His work in Merriam attracted the attention of Kansas City developers who were developing the residential subdivision of Hyde Park. They hired George to landscape the 7.8-acre gully that was adjacent to their property into a private park. and the park eventually, as you know, became owned by the city of Kansas City and part of its park system. He designed a road network, which is common to the system here and many of his other systems, where he placed the road adjacent to the park rather than bounce back houses onto it, so the park became a common living room and focal place for the community, a critical part of his design. And he also, through that effort, met Jarvis and Conklin, a Kansas City development company that was developing new subdivisions in Roland Park, Maryland, in Cleveland, Ohio, Euclid Heights, and Ogden, Utah, and other locations. And this is important because, you know, the breadth of George's work was remarkable, right? He's designing a park in Merriam, he's designing railroad station grounds, but from the very beginning of his career, he embraced the real estate community. He understood that real estate was an important part of the driver of the city and saw it not as a threat to open space, but as a useful partner in that exercise. So that leads us to the third characteristic of George Kessler. He was a very connected man. He knew a lot of folks. He made friends easily. He ingratiated himself to civic leaders in almost every city, or really every city that he worked, but he was a soft-spoken and patient man. And the other thing he did, which is, Chris Diamond is probably a member of the commercial club up here, but George joined the commercial club, the Evanston Golf Club in Kansas City. He had joined the commercial club in Memphis and Cincinnati and so forth that put him elbow to elbow at the dinner table with the power brokers of the city. Some of those power brokers were journalists. They controlled the media, which is a remarkable flashback to contemporary events, the power of the media to shape ideas, right? To find someone like William Rockwell Nelson, who had published the Kansas City Star, who believed in a good roads program, who had visited the great park systems of the East Coast, and who championed the idea of a park system for Kansas City. He became the great patron of Kessler in Kansas City, but so did George Dealey in Dallas, the publisher of the Dallas Morning News, or Hugh Slater in El Paso, the publisher of that city's great paper. So understanding the media, using it as a key tool of an effort is important. We do a lot of urban park design. We do a lot of park system master planning. And when we begin a public engagement process, we oftentimes have a client say, wow, that's really an extensive public engagement process. That's a lot of meetings. Do we really need to have all of those meetings? And I look at them kind of coldly and I say, you know, we need to have those meetings for two reasons. One, we sincerely want people's input. We want to understand what they dream of and aspire to and seek in their park system. But more importantly, and let's never lose track of this, is it's the beginning of a political campaign. The preparation of a park system master plan is a political act in many ways, because you're trying to coalesce all of the interest of all of the people in this room and beyond around a bold idea, and to devote financial resources to shaping that idea. August Meyer, that was mentioned earlier, became Kessler's great friends, another of his champions, former head of the Municipal Improvement Association, first president of the Park Board. Meyer was the guy who fought for the charter amendments that made the park system here in Kansas City necessary, and one's reminded that there's a legal component to park work as well. That Delbert Half, the attorney for the Park Board, also one of Kessler's best friends. Kessler's ability to manage between the media, the legal community, the business community, as well as a designer, the kinds of traditions that he learned from Bonskell and others in Germany were critical to his efforts. And interestingly enough, and an aside, Meyer, like Kessler, was a German immigrant. And it's not surprising that Kessler found his greatest success in cities like Kansas City and St. Louis and Denver, Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, Cincinnati, that had major German populations. The next great attribute of George Kessler, he was a systematic thinker, right? And remember, in 1893, when the first park system master plan, there were episodic examples of people building boulevards in the United States. Olmsted had done it in Brooklyn, areas where one park was linked to another by a short stretch of boulevard. But until this time, never a plan so bold, so comprehensive, as to suggest an entire park system might be linked together, and to study the topography of the city, the traffic patterns, the population densities, the growth, the industrial land uses, and really try to craft a plan that shapes the future of the city. Now, Kessler said that a park system must be divided into three parts. The smaller parks and squares, that notion of villages that we saw earlier, the larger parks and the boulevards that are connecting them together. The smaller ones were really important in the thickly populated parts of the city and became the breathing spots and often playgrounds, independent more or less from the system. Now, what are the principles that guide the plan? George Kessler never used the word ecological. The term ecology was not coined until 1866 by another German, Ernst Hack. But his love of nature, his understanding of topography, his understanding of hydrology certainly was a critical part of the process. He envisioned the Parade and Penn Valley Park and West Terrace and North Terrace as what we would call today community parks, larger than neighborhood parks and central to the served neighborhoods. This was a hierarchical system. There was a hierarchy of parks serving different needs connected by a series of boulevards. He gave particular attention in his plan to the West Bluff, which was a notorious eyesore, the rough clay and limestone bluffs that were covered with squatter shacks. The Kansas City Star had spoken greatly of those shacks and the sight that new visitors to the city saw from Union Station. The transformation of Kessler's plan was remarkable. The Parade, another of his community-wide parks. But he also spent a great deal of time talking about neighborhood parks, of small parks, of playgrounds. And we have to remember from this that the tradition of German park design and active recreation, because it was the neighborhood parks that provided the opportunities for playgrounds, right? And you have to remember that a survey was done in the United States in 1904, and at that time, throughout the entire country, there were only 26 playgrounds. That was a point in time when a German immigrant created the first playground in America in St. Louis. And so this drive for small-scale active recreation was critical and important to the effort. The 1893 park system linked the larger parks, North Terrace, West Terrace, Penn Valley, with almost 10 miles of parkways, including the three crosstown boulevards running east-west, Independent, Linwood, Armour, two north-south, the Paseo, East, now Benton Parkways. They were planned 100 feet wide, 40-foot central roadway, 30 feet of parking or planting, not real cars, parking on each side, triple rows of trees, a really remarkable visual impact. But to make way for many of those boulevards, slums were cleared. Now, if I were critical of George's work, and in fairness to him, it was not something that very many people paid attention to in that day, is that he gave no attention in his reports to what became of those who were displaced by his parks. He was aware that the city had the ability to transform Kansas City, or his park system had the ability to transform Kansas City socially, but he was not as attentive as he might have been to those less fortunate. Now, before we brand Kessler racist, as some have done, it's important to remember when Olmsted and Vaux created New York Central Park, Seneca Village, a large African-American settlement, was forcibly removed to make way for Central Park. And in that condition as well, there was no attention given to what became of the people who were displaced. So this question of spatial equity, of social equity, is a critical one in Kessler's day, but I think even more so in our day, and I'll talk about that further in a moment. So the slums were cleared to make way for boulevards. He was aware of the value and the potential to uplift the entire community by these improvements. He built the Grand Paseo wider than the other parkways, triple rows of trees either side. The architectural embellishments that you saw in Park Muskow, a wide variety of trees. The rights of way were so wide that the streets essentially became nurseries for trees along the corridor. But it provided a way of creating monumentality, of bringing this dusty city a level of gentility that it had never seen before, and providing a way of structuring the city. Now, I know your park director is probably terrified by photographs of this with this intricate planting, and maybe some of you are, although I see a few eyes light out that you actually like this. But this term, Tapisgartnerie, carpet gardening, was all the fashion and the rage in Germany at the time. You saw it in many of Linné's and von Skell's work, and Kessler used it, as did other German landscape architects in the United States, much to the chagrin and the displeasure of Olmsted and his followers. But it points out that the other principle of the system, which is that it was beautiful, right? That the Paseo was the jewel of the system. It was given the name, in part, I understand, because of Paseo de la Forma in Mexico City. Never found why it was given that name. But again, my theory is that the railroads from Kansas City certainly connected into New Mexico and to Arizona and as far as Mexico City. And the kind of architectural elements you see in the Kansas City system are really based upon those origins. So this was really a park system that was the envy of other unsophisticated cities in the mainland of America. And I would suggest that it is bold a vision of what is called the City Beautiful movement, as the World Columbian Exposition that Olmsted designed that opened in Chicago in 1893, that Kessler's work was every bit as bold. And when you realize it was accomplished in a smaller, perhaps less sophisticated city than Chicago at the time of 1893, it's even more remarkable. When you think of the grand boulevards of Kansas City, your mind now, I hope, returns to Unter den Linden in Berlin, and the remarkable comparison between Gillum Parkway and the grand streets. George, despite his concern for the social impact on those less fortunate in his plan, I think did try to deliver an equitable plan. Not the same over every part of the city, but equitable, right? And that he did address blight in the sense that he was trying to improve certain parts of the city, but really didn't answer the question. What he did do in the creation of the Park District was create a series of districts primarily intended to accommodate the appraisal of land and property, but also to make sure that every voter in the city was represented in tax elections and so forth, and distribute those park systems in a way that made sure that it achieved economic success. The plan was driven by economics. Remember, from the very beginning of his career, he worked for the real estate community. Not the least among these was Jesse Clyde Nichols. George designed the first phases of the Country Club District, and Nichols would say that there is no better address in the city than a residence on the boulevard. And so I would ask those of you who may live on those boulevards if that factor holds clear yet today. And when you look at Kessler's principles, what was genius about it is the principles were clear. The idea of a series of routes that connected the city together, the idea of a hierarchy of parks, the idea of a park system driven by topography and by landscape and by hydrology, that it could be extended over time, one would say indefinitely. And even before his 1893 report was released, there was work underway on Independence Boulevard. There were many hurdles along the way. It wasn't until 1900, 7 years after the first report was released, that the legal hurdles were largely past them and they could begin the development of the plan. And what Kessler had drawn would take almost 50 years to realize. Be bold as Goethe said, because there is magic in it, and George was certainly bold. Around 1900, other good things started to happen. He married a stenographer in the Public Works Department in Kansas City named Ida Grant Field. Married for the first time, had an only child, and his work caught the attention of the newly formed American Society of Landscape Architects. 16 founding members who wrote George a letter in response to his application, rejecting his application. Because they said his work is too closely aligned with superintending of parks and not in pure design. And that was a role that they did not find appropriate for their society. So here you have a master landscape architect who's created one of the great park systems, not only in the United States, but in the world, who's rejected by his peers because of the breadth of his capabilities, and it was the breadth of those capabilities that actually led to his success. His ability to navigate political framework, the financial framework, the organizational framework, as well as to design a remarkably beautiful system, right? Now, curiously, all 16 of those people had English surnames. The American Society of Park Superintendent began to be populated by people named Theodore Wirth, the park superintendent in Hartford, Connecticut. The Germans formed one society, the Americans formed another, and life goes on. Memphis, Tennessee also was attracted by George's work, and he was hired to prepare the first park system master plan in Memphis and in Tennessee in 1901, and to design the great Overton Park, I'll talk about in a minute, which is the flagship park of that system. Truly beautiful park. His work in Kansas City also attracted the attention of civic leaders in St. Louis, Missouri, who, after the success of the World Columbia Exposition in Chicago in 1893, says, we need one of those. Let's hire that guy from Kansas City. Let's hire a group of architects from Kansas City and St. Louis and Minneapolis and Omaha and elsewhere, and let's create the next great World's Fair, right? Kessler and his family, his sister, his mother, his new wife, his new son, moved to St. Louis, moved to Vandeventer Place, which was the residential address in the city. He made a lot of money as a landscape architect in the late 1900s. Doesn't work that way anymore for some reason. But George did pretty well. He was hired to execute the landscape of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, and to do that, he had to build a team. The first two people he hired were Henry Wright, a native of Kansas City, and who would go and earn fame in his own right as an architect and town planner, and this lady, Etta Suttermeister. Etta Suttermeister was the first graduate of the School of Landscape Architecture at the Missouri, get a little choked up talking about her, at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and probably the first woman practitioner of landscape architecture in the United States, and a native of Kansas City. George worked with a team of 16 architects to create the plan for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. This hill, Art Hill, was the focus of the Fine Arts Building. You've been to this building, the St. Louis Art Museum. The Grand Cascade still remains. A series of palaces devoted to machinery and industry and transportation formed the lower part of the park. New buildings were added to the campus of Washington University in St. Louis, and this whole third of Forest Park was transformed to make way for the World's Fair. Forest Park, by the way, was originally designed by Maximilian Kern, another professionally trained German landscape architect. George saw the undergrounding of the River de Pere. The one piece of his work and all of the projects he's done that I think is most questionable from an ecological point of view, but the River de Pere had become a sewer in Kansas City, and they moved countless number of trees to make the park happen and do so in a way that it could be restored over time. The results was truly remarkable. It was the largest installation of electric lights in the history of the United States, when the President of the United States flipped the switch on April 30th, 1904. And George was tasked with the restoration of Forest Park in 1907 following the fair. His wife, unfortunately, was admitted to a sanitarium for tuberculosis in Green Bay, and he spent the rest of his years as a single father with the support of his mother and sister. George was a remarkably comprehensive thinker, and this is something that we've lost in this day of professionalism as bodies of knowledge have become siloed. George had the ability to span disciplines. Remember, at this point in time, there had not been a city plan for any American city. So the tools that he was using, parks and boulevards, were the only way to shape a city. He did the Park and Boulevard plan for Indianapolis, that wonderful detailed planting that you all love, a park system master plan for Denver and Fort Worth. And then in 1907, the Civic League of St. Louis formed the City Plan Association. Henry Wright chaired the Committee on Civic Buildings and created the plan that you see here. Kessler prepared the first park and boulevard system for St. Louis. There were committees on housing, transportation, and other elements, and they generated what became the first city plan in the United States. His plan for Kansas City was probably his penultimate park and recreation master plan. August Kessler, who was the park superintendent for New York, said that it represented not a city, merely a city that contained parks that was not merely penetrated by circuits of green, but the city as a park in itself. So as each of these systems evolved, Kessler's thinking became more and more sophisticated, and the evolution of his schemes became more and more elegant. 1911, Kessler was hired by the city of his youth, Dallas, to generate the first city plan for Dallas. This is led to the creation of the dramatic parks, Turtle Creek, White Rock Park in the city, but for the first time in his own efforts, he spoke of questions of transportation, of housing, and of land use and distribution of land uses within the city, but remained to have a focus on beauty. He was a remarkably committed individual. Remember 1914, we had a little skirmish in Europe. We had war with Germany, and in the United States, the German language was suppressed. German newspapers were closed, German schools were closed. Germans often anglicized their name. In Louisiana, they in fact, francifized their name? I don't know what he would just say. We have this great crawfish bar called Emails, which a few years ago I learned was actually Himmels. So they turned it from German to French at the time of World War I, and German Americans were persecuted. And so Kessler was in a position of what do I do? What he did was throw himself into the war effort. And it's important to remember that this persecution extended a long time, and the greatest of all evils, Prohibition in 1920, greatly suppressed German culture. George threw himself into the war effort. There were 2 U.S. corporations founded in response to World War I. One headed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the senior son, also a landscape architect and planner. And it's an important time in American history because the U.S. Housing Corporation created housing at armaments factories. The Camp Planning Division created new bases for training of troops bound for the war effort. Kessler was also remarkably adaptive. He continued to do park and boulevard work, the great Herman Park in Houston, the flagship park of that city. But through university contacts in Missouri and Kansas, he came to design the University of Nanking, the University of Shanghai, now Shanghai University of Technology, 2 universities in China. And in 1925 or 1923, near the time of his death, he prepared the first city plan for El Paso, which was actually published after his death. Now, herein lies a great warm story, I think. Remember that story of that image of the Paseo and the shanties that were being torn down, and the challenge of spatial equity? In the El Paso plan, Kessler was called to create an international bridge that connected Mexico with the United States and to create grand monumental space that would symbolize the friendship of those 2 countries and link those 2 countries together. And in that document, he wrote profusely about his concern for the brown people of El Paso, about the preservation of their culture, and about the uplifting of their well-being. So George Kessler was an extremely well-educated man. He was very well-traveled. He continued to adapt over time, and he came in his day to appreciate the true social implications of the park system that he created. He was a very pragmatic man. The few speeches that I found that he wrote spoke invariably about the actual distribution of the cost of the Kansas City Park and Boulevard system. People were mesmerized by the quality of design of the Kansas City system, but even more interested in how do we pay for this, how do we make it happen. So, I like to ask myself at a time like this, George would be 157 years old, I think. But if he were here, what would he do today? Right? He would urge you, I'm certain, he was a very, very, very modest man. He would urge you to restore and protect his work. He would urge you to reclaim from the automobile the parkways that he designed as pleasure drives, and remember, park ways. He would be pragmatic and realize that his parks and parkways needed to be adapted to contemporary needs. The automobile was not as prolific in his day as it is today, but at the same time, as an educated man, he would know that the times were changing and that it may be possible to right-size those parks, those boulevards, to a form that is more humane and provides for multimodal traffic. He would understand that the green spaces that he created could be utilized for stormwater management as well as for active recreation and passive recreation. And I am confident that he would work to understand how to do that while maintaining the historic integrity of the system. He would continue to expand the park system based upon the principles that you saw of beauty, of equity, right? Of social transformation, of ecology, right? I tried to find for tonight a map. Someone should create it if they haven't already. I haven't found it. That took all the open space systems of Kansas City and all of the surrounding cities and put it on one map. Anybody seen one of those maps? Do they connect together? Yeah, on Google you could do it, right? But what is truly designated park? What is someone's backyards? Because the principles of responding to topography, of connecting drainage systems, of having a hierarchy of park system needs could candidly extend forever as the city grows, right? And so, like George, we would be called upon to think comprehensively and think systematically about how those pieces all come together, right? And as a man of the world who had business relationships all over the country, indeed all over the world, you would partner with your colleagues in Indianapolis and Dallas and Denver and Cincinnati and other cities to learn how to protect and enhance his park systems as well. Now, you are not alone in this challenge. We are in discussions with the Memphis Park System and Overton Park, right? And it's an interesting dilemma with historic parks and historic park systems. What do I do? I suspect some of you would say, I'm a historian. It should be restored exactly the way George drew it. It's a work of art, and it should be not be modified. I see a nodding head on the front row here, right? Some of you would say, man, all this talk about dead Germans is kind of boring me. And I think it's a tabula rasa. It's a clean slate. We can start all over again, and let's, thanks George and Mr. Meyer and Nelson for helping create this park system. But we got the park system. We'll put it to use as we see fit and to meet our contemporary needs. And some of you may say, maybe there's a middle ground where we can define what's truly critical about the historical integrity of the system and add innovative uses that respond to contemporary needs. So These kinds of questions suggest the need for public dialogue, a discussion among the people in this room about where you land, where your city lands on these questions. I found a map from Mark of the streams and lakes in greater Kansas City and overlaid Kessler's park system plan. And you realize the streams and the lakes and the drainages do, in fact, go on forever. And that basic principles of his system could be extended for miles in every direction and provide a framework for the greater Kansas City. Now, we're working in Detroit now, and this is not Kessler's work, but in the last 48 hours, I've heard 3 numbers for how Kansas City addresses its combined sewer system. The first optimistic number was a $2 billion price tag. Late last night, somebody who was kind of remorse said $6 billion. Somebody came down in the middle and said $4 billion. $2 billion, $4 billion, $6 billion, that's a big price tag. And are there ways to address that problem that allows that money not to go into pipes in the ground, but to go into the creation of a great park and open space system? You have a lot of vacant land. Land Bank's website says 3,000 plus. I'm sure it's much more vacant lots around the city. We've been working in Detroit to understand how the historic ecology of that city might shape vacant land policy, provide a basis for structuring open space, and so forth, and building a water budget for Detroit that is totally based on capturing and treating water through surface treatment and not with pipes. I'm fairly confident if George were here today, he would be all over this, because there's a way to think synthetically, to think systematically, to think comprehensively, and solve your problems in that way. The Rouge River in Detroit, there are 36 combined sewer outflows that flow in that river. The light blue lines that you see on this map are the hidden streams of Detroit. To map the hidden streams of Kansas City, to understand how they might be serviced and form the basis of an expanded and improved park system, and put those dollars to use in a creative way is important. Forest Park, the site of the World Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, is dealing with the challenge of the fact that the automobile has taken over Forest Park in St. Louis. The surrounding roads, including the great Kings Highway, have been consumed by automobiles. How can those surrounding streets and connectors be converted into complete streets that serve the zoo, the art museum, the municipal theater, and so forth? Can those streets be right-sized in a way that take advantage of multimodal forms of transportation that increase the amount of green space and to accommodate stormwater? How do we deal with a park like Penn Valley or Roanoke or Overton Park in Memphis? Can we begin to take all the history that's been accumulated about the park system of Kansas City and put it to use? Can we do things like take Kessler's original drawing and overlay it over an aerial photograph to understand where the changes have occurred? How has parking of the Memphis Zoo consumed roughly a quarter of the park? How have woods of non-native species expand to consume the greenswards and so forth? How have maintenance facilities been inappropriately converted into the plan? How do we take Swoop Park and do the same thing? And again, understand how the expansion of parking, of new uses and expanded uses like golf and so forth have or haven't contributed to the historic integrity of Kessler's system. About 15 years ago, on the 100th anniversary of the South Bend, Indiana park system, I was asked to give a speech to talk about Kessler. And before I started, the park superintendent grabbed me by the elbow and he says, "Hey, get in the car, I got to go show you something." I said, "Okay." He drove me to a park and he very proudly said, "You see that path? You see that path? That was on a plan George drew in 1910. It's been 100, I guess it was 2010 now. It's been 100 years, and we finally built what George drew." I like to say that great ideas have legs. They hang around. They work their way through your brain. They keep you thinking, right? Last year, Dallas broke ground on Town Lake, an idea that George had put forward in 1911 for the Trinity River bottoms. Now, the biggest issue that we find in park system plannings today is the question of spatial equity. The idea that the attributes, the benefits of park and recreational systems do not accrue equitably to all of a city's citizens, right? We all like to live next to parks. If we have the economic means, we move next to parks. If we don't have the economic means, we don't get to move next to parks, right? If we live next to a park, and the park has a finite park system, guess how the maintenance dollars get distributed? Inequitably. If we plan new facilities and the park acreage is not equitably distributed throughout the city, how are new capital dollars distributed in the city? Inequitably. And by equitable, I don't mean equal. I mean fair. And that's for each city to describe in their own terms. Took Kessler's park system plan and laid it over a median income map of Kansas City. The lighter colors are the lowest income. This is a map I suspect all of you understand instinctively, right? Wealth has moved to the suburb, it's moved to the perimeter. I've been told, I've seen with my eyes, this pattern seems to be reversing itself. But the question is, are the benefits of the system equitably distributed? And are parks and boulevards enough to transform the city? They certainly provide the framework. But remember, Kessler evolved from being a landscape architect, a designer of parks, to being a city planner, to thinking about systems, about transportation, of housing, of land use, in a synthetic way to shape the cities that he was around. So near the end of his life, George was completing the comprehensive plan for El Paso, the first for that city. He was working with Kansas City landscape architects Hare and Hare to design the city of Longview, Washington. And he was designing the residential subdivision of Loma de Chapultepec in Mexico City, the premier residential neighborhood in Mexico City, a connection made through Kansas City railroad interest. On a trip to Indianapolis, he fell ill, and after a brief time in the St. Anthony Hospital, which overlooked one of its parkways, on March 19th, 1923, he passed away. The Kansas City Park Board said of Kessler he was intimate, confidentially intimate, during the continuous period of his service with every member of the board with whom he served. The completeness of his knowledge of the problems he had to deal with, that is the past, the present, and future development and growth of the city, its topography, its environs, its aspirations, and the spirit of the people. And the wisdom of his deductions and prophecies in relation to it all were astonishing to those to whom he revealed himself. Companionable, wise, without obtrusiveness, he had faith and begot faith in the work of his hands. And what was the source and motive of it all? It is not hard to seek. It was not, was it personal ambition? No. Self-seeking, personal exploitation or personal aggrandizement seemed to be utterly foreign to his makeup. Intimate in the knowledge of nature, he loved it. His art was revealing and uncovering and emphasizing and setting, as it were, in a picture so as not to make instantly apparent to the work a day mind and the vision of the stranger the beauties of nature which he saw with such distinct clearness. But even deeper in his heart was the love of the people whom he served. The good angel who spoke to him of them and their welfare was his inspiration. Fundamental with him was a conception that if the city would enjoy the fine things of tomorrow, they must be planned for today. So George Kessler was educated. Hopefully you are a bit more yourself. He was bold. Are you bold enough? He was connected. This is a community of interest that can move mountains. He thought systematically. He thought expansively. Be bold, for there is magic in it. He thought comprehensively. He was committed. He was adaptive. He was pragmatic. I believe that each of you has those characteristics, and certainly collectively you do. You have been given by your forefathers a truly magnificent work of art. It's a work of art to be cherished, to be preserved, to be expanded upon, and be carefully adapted to contemporary needs. I would urge you to do so in a way that benefits all the citizens of this great city in an equitable way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kurt. I think we might have time for maybe 2, maybe 3 questions. We'll keep it real short. We'll use the microphones,
Ladies
please.
first.
Ma'am,
I'm a Southerner. It's ladies
If you
first.
can come down and use the microphone, please.
Okay, I'll quickly speak while she's making her way here.
Okay.
You speak about nature. There's a few examples I do involved with Roanoke Park that I don't think Kessler was involved in, but wonder if you could reflect on and think of things that maybe he was involved in. And that was the Ramble in Central Park, which is a completely invented natural landscape.
Yep.
As well, the gardens at the University of North Carolina Asheville campus. I don't know if you've been there. It's really
It's been a while, but yeah.
a beautiful space, and that one is dear to my heart because it's all native plants to the Appalachian area. And then the other one is Dunn Woods on the University of Indiana campus.
Well, you know, it's really interesting. As I've done research on these topics, you kind of have to put a timeline together against bodies of knowledge, and you realize that it wasn't until the mid-19th century, right around Kessler's time, that we had the science to understand surface hydrology. You know, so you wonder, did they calculate the floodplain in those days, right? When was geology invented? Ecology the term was coined in the mid-century, right? So much of what we take for granted as knowledge today simply didn't exist, or existed in a very rudimentary form. In the 19th century, George Huseman at Missouri Botanical Gardens was a classic example of that. The English, the Germans, the Swedes were about collecting plants from all over the world. It was about horticultural display. So the idea that we were using predominantly plant materials and understanding how, you know, that impacted a situation ecologically simply would not have occurred to them. They were sort of the more the merrier, right? The more stuff we plant, the better it's going to be, and it's all good for nature. We know we have a lot more nuanced view. So I think George was probably right there with everybody else in those days, I think. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have my historic timeline lined up, but I formed the impression that naming the Paseo might have been related to the Spanish theme of the Alameda Plaza. So do you know the source of that name?
I don't.
And whether there was any
I
influence
don't. That's
in
the
close with real estate developers might relate those two.
Yeah, there may be somebody in this
There's
room
a long
that's
shot.
found the source of those terms, but you know, I think there's a reasoned hunch that railroads' connections to the southwest of Mexico is probably a source of fascination with Spanish architecture, Spanish colonial architecture, and names and so forth. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. This was phenomenal.
Thanks.
You mentioned our first major Union station, which was Union Depot.
Right.
Believe me, there was nothing park-like around it.
Right. I believe you. I believe you. Well, again, you know, trains were the cars or the web of their day, right? So you have to understand the economic circumstance in which people operated, right? And so one of the things so George, you know, became very closely acquainted with the dominant industry in America at the time, and that was critical to launching his career. You know, the other thing that people who are critical about his work as a city-shaping tool is the first zoning ordinance in the world, in Germany was 1879. And German cities had comprehensive plans in the late 1880s, 1900s. Ambler versus Euclid Realty, the Supreme Court case that established the legal basis for the zoning in the United States, that decision was made in 1926, right? So 47 years after the Germans were using zoning. But Kessler and a lot of the other Germans were in constant contact with their peers in the old country, right? George he never got in the American Society, he didn't get in the American Society of Landscape Architects until the last few years of his life, but for all of his career, he was a member of the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Gartenkunst, for garden art, the German Society for Garden Art. So that's how he stayed connected to that part of his profession, and clearly he would have known about advances in city planning. Just finding how to implement it was tough.
We'll make this our last question of the evening.
Thanks. I was curious if you had looked at other cities in which Kessler was involved in the planning and did the median income overlay, if you had seen similar results in some of his other cities, and if so, have any of those other cities made any efforts to improve?
You know, we were talking before we started about this question of spatial equity. We're working on the Vancouver, British Columbia Park System plan, and we've gone really deep into the question about how you measure spatial equity, what constitutes lack of access to parks. To date, Boston, New York, San Francisco have done work on spatial equity. The Vancouver thing, we hope to go another level beyond what they've done. But a lot of people are talking about social equity, which is a little bit different question in my mind than spatial equity. I don't think in a park system we're trying to deal with income disparity. We're trying to deal with distribution of recreational opportunities. So there are a lot of examples where income has declined along boulevards, and I would argue that's principally because the boulevards have been modified and traffic speeds and traffic volumes have turned those parkways into traffic sewers. And nobody wants to live next to a sewer, right?
That actually didn't answer the question. So
Huh?
You didn't answer the question
Okay.
that she asked. So go ahead and answer the question.
Well, why don't you clarify for me what I need to answer?
Well, she can clarify.
Okay.
I feel like he answered my question, but go.
Yeah. Why don't you ask me a question? I'll take a shot at yours.
Kurt, thank you
Okay.
very much.